Another problem we've stressed in some of our work on antipsychotics has been the heterogeneity in treatment effects, which I don't think it's solved at all by subpopulations, and I'll get to that later. But that's essentially the focus of CER, is essentially to have product-specific conclusions about what's good or bad product, as opposed to medical practice. Many times it's more about matching the product to the right patient, having all products out there, but then essentially more thinking about who's getting what product. The fact that if you make product-specific conclusions coming out of CR, for example, we analyzed the CATIA trial for antipsychotics. If the CATIA trial, which was used, was to encourage payers to essentially not cover atypicals as much as they covered first-generation drugs, that's a product-specific response to the evidence, and we showed that that could have dramatic effects on essentially lowering the health of the schizophrenia population in our case, because many people, if you simulated what would happen with a coverage response to that type of evidence, many people who would not respond on typicals would respond on atypicals, and they would now face higher co-pays or less reimbursement. Now, in terms of CR and particular aspects of devices and diagnostics, I think diagnostics is actually going to be an opportunity for manufacturers if CER gets done correctly. It's hard to think of a worse environment for diagnostics than currently exists, where we have cost-based pricing, essentially generic pricing on many diagnostics, so just having lab tests priced at cost. That obviously many times do not reflect their value. And if you think of a companion diagnostic, think of it as essentially converting what economists call an experience good. An experience good is a good where you basically learn how good the good is by consuming it, which is what we traditionally do, to what we call an inspection good. An inspection good is where you learn the quality of the good before you actually consume it, which is what personalized medicine might do through companion diagnostics. If that's the case, we've done work essentially showing, well, how can you quantify the value added of a companion diagnostic by basically being the value added over consuming the product and thereby learning how well it's going to be working. And it's not surprising that these products are coming up in oncology where the consumption value of learning is very, very high, because you could be on the wrong therapy and your tumor could be growing, as opposed to asthma, erectile dysfunction, et cetera. You're not going to see personalized medicines in those situations because the cost of learning through consumption is extremely low. So the value added comes essentially relative to how well can you learn from just consuming the drug, in this case, similar aspects of devices, I would argue. And we showed for diagnostic that could open up markets, we showed that there were essentially two values to this. One was to open up markets of previously of goods that couldn't, or drugs that could not previously be consumed. That's sort of the rescue effect of a diagnostic. That expands the market for the drug, as opposed to contraction of the market, which is the traditional effect discussed of the companion diagnostic, limiting non-responders to not consume the drug. But we have a study showing that essentially at a $20 billion value of opening up the COX-2 market from a diagnostic. And if a diagnostic is priced at cost, that's a tremendous problem for innovation incentives, where you generate $20 billion of value, but your price is cost when you come out. That's a mismatch between the social value of the diagnostic and the incentive to innovate. So I think in terms of developing better metrics for diagnostics, I think there's a lot of work to be done for that, but there's also a lot of potential in demonstrating to payers why these things are why diagnostics are valuable, and therefore getting improved reimbursement from the current situation, which I think is pretty adverse to innovation incentives. Lastly, let me just conclude by making some broad comparison between the NHS and the HHS here in the US, and why I think the reimbursement issues here in the US are different from those in the UK. The big difference is that the US is such a big market. For drugs, it's about half of sales or even more of profits being made in the US, even though US is only about a fifth of the world economies. So it's highly overrepresented here in the US. Compare that to the UK, which is roughly about 3% of sales. That means that NICE and other agencies in the UK face a different trade-off than the US does. They can essentially set their reimbursement policy irrespective of innovation. They're not going to have much impact on innovation by being such a small share of the market, unless they're also influencing other countries, which they for sure are. The question is how much. But a small country doesn't have to be the UK. It could be another European country. Does not have an innovation trade-off in setting their reimbursement policy, because most of the innovation gets done for the U.S. Profitable market. Now turn to the U.S., and the situation is drastically different. If we implement the type of policies that a smaller country implements, it would have dramatic effects on world innovation. And that, I think, is the real difference between the two, between the European experience and the U.S. experience. The second big difference, I think, is that in the U.S. we have the private sector much more present than in Europe. And we basically have models for using the private sector to determine value of medical products, and then having the public sector essentially free ride off that knowledge. We're doing that in Medicaid, essentially, when we have the Medicaid rebates. We'll let the market determine market prices, and then we have the Medicaid program essentially taking those relative prices in the market and cutting them down a little bit for a big buyer. I think that's a model which we should try to adapt much more frequently or more prevalently to try to sort of improve using some of the information coming out of the private sector to guide public reimbursement, something that can't be done in a single payer system. So I think I've outlined some broad categories of how CR fits in, and I hope this provides a background for the more detailed discussion that I think all 3 or 4 of us will have following the last presentation. Thank you.